Welcome back. Tonight, I'd like you to imagine standing on a quiet frontier at the edge of a fatting empire. No banners, no declarations, just uncertainty. The year is 1299. History tells us this is where the Ottoman Empire began. But when you look closely, nothing seems to begin at all. In this episode, we'll step into that uncertainty and explore how survival, not spectacle, shaped one of history's longest-lasting powers. The founding of the Ottoman Beylik by Osman in 1299 is one of those moments that looks small at the time and only later reveals how consequential it really was. What makes it fascinating is that Osman set out to build an empire. He almost certainly didn't. The early Ottoman state was modest, fragile, and deeply uncertain. Osman ruled a frontier principality on the edge of a declining Byzantine world, surrounded by rival Turkic beyliks just as ambitious as his own. There was nothing inevitable about Ottoman success. What was distinctive was positioning. Osman's beylik sat on a volatile frontier where warfare, migration, and opportunity blended together. This borderland environment rewarded adaptability more than pedigree. Osman wasn't the most powerful ruler in Anatolia, but he was unusually good at attracting followers, warriors, converts, displaced peasants, and adventurers, all bound less by ethnicity and more by shared opportunity and loyalty. The Ottomans also benefited from timing. Byzantine authority in northwestern Anatolia was weak but not gone, strong enough to offer land and prestige through conquest, weak enough to be steadily pushed back. Expansion could happen incrementally, village by village, without triggering overwhelming resistance. Another quiet strength was flexibility. Early Ottomans absorbed local customs, intermarried, tolerated religious diversity, and governed pragmatically. This wasn't ideological tolerance in a modern sense. It was survival strategy. It made Ottoman rule feel less disruptive than conquest usually does. In that sense, 1299 doesn't mark the birth of an empire. It marks the emergence of a method, a way of expanding, ruling, and adapting that proved resilient over centuries. Looking back, the founding of the Ottoman Beylik feels less like a dramatic beginning and more like the first ripple in a very long wave. Few events better illustrate how history often turns not on grand declarations, but on quiet advantages compounded over time. History likes beginnings. It prefers clean dates, named founders, and moments that feel decisive. They help us organize the past into something that resembles a story with an opening scene, a first act, and a direction of travel. For the Ottoman state, that beginning is often given as the year 1299, when Osman, son of Ertugrul, is said to have founded a new political entity, the Ottoman Beylik. But for the people living in northwestern Anatolia at the end of the 13th century, 1299 did not feel like the start of anything. No proclamation echoed across the plains. No banner was raised announcing a new dynasty. No border was drawn to separate Ottoman land from the world around it. Life continued much as it had the year before, uncertain, fragmented, and shaped by forces far larger than any single man. The idea of a founding year is a gift from hindsight. Later generations, looking back across 6 centuries of Ottoman rule, needed a point of origin, a symbolic place to begin the narrative of empire. But what they found when they searched for that origin was not a moment of creation, but a moment of survival. The Ottomans did not emerge because history demanded them. They emerged because they did not disappear. To understand what 1299 really represents, we have to let go of the idea that states are born fully formed. In the medieval world, political entities often drifted into existence gradually, their outlines only becoming clear decades later. What later historians call a state often began as a loose network of households, followers, and obligations, held together not by law, but by shared risk. Osman's world was one where permanence was rare. Anatolia in the late 13th century was crowded with small principalities, tribal confederations, religious communities, and remnants of older powers. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had once imposed a measure of order, had fractured under pressure from Mongol domination and internal rivalry. Authority no longer flowed cleanly from a center. Instead, it pooled locally, wherever someone could defend land, distribute resources, and offer protection. In this environment, no ruler could assume longevity. Most political experiments failed quickly. Leaders rose, attracted followers, lost battles, and vanished from the record. The landscape was littered with forgotten names, men who ruled briefly, ambitiously, and then not at all. Osman was not obviously different from them. If anything, his position was modest. His territory was small, his resources limited, and his legitimacy thin. What distinguished Osman was not the clarity of his vision, but the durability of his position. When later Ottoman chroniclers wrote about their founder, they portrayed him as a man chosen by fate, guided by divine dreams, and destined to rule. These stories tell us much about how the Ottomans later understood themselves, but very little about how the early Ottomans actually lived. In reality, Osman's authority was informal, negotiated, and constantly tested. He ruled not through institutions, but through relationships. His power did not come from ancient lineage or religious office, but from his ability to hold people together in a world where fragmentation was the norm. That makes the concept of a founding misleading. 1299 does not mark the creation of something new so much as the continuation of something precarious. It represents a moment when Osman's group had survived long enough to be noticed, long enough to be remembered, but not long enough to be secure. Even the sources themselves are uncertain. Contemporary records from Osman's lifetime are sparse. Most accounts of his early rule were written generations later, shaped by memory, myth, and political need. The year 1299 appears not because something clearly happened then, but because it offered a convenient anchor, a symbolic line separating what came before from what followed. In truth, the Ottoman Beylik did not begin in a year. It began in conditions. It began in a frontier zone where identities were fluid, alliances temporary, and violence routine. It began among people who expected instability and adapted to it. It began without a clear sense of scale, without any expectation that this local arrangement would last, let alone expand beyond recognition. From this perspective, the founding of the Ottoman state looks less like a birth and more like a quiet refusal to collapse. Osman did not announce an empire. He maintained a foothold. He did not redefine the political order. He navigated its absence. His success lay not in transforming the world around him, but in learning how to live within its fractures. And that is why the Ottomans matter. Not because their beginning was dramatic, but because it was. Not because they emerged fully formed, but because they accumulated slowly, almost invisibly. The story of 1299 is not a story of destiny fulfilled. It is a story of uncertainty endured. The illusion of a beginning tells us more about how history is written than how it is lived. The real foundation of the Ottoman Beylik was not a date, but a pattern, one that would repeat itself, adapt, and endure for centuries. To understand why a figure like Osman could endure, we need to understand the world he inherited, a landscape where order had not vanished, but had dissolved into fragments. For much of the 13th century, Anatolia had lived under the shadow of a recognizable authority, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The Seljuks were not a modern state, but they provided something rare in a medieval frontier society: predictability. Roads were maintained, trade flowed between cities, taxes were collected with some regularity, and power, while imperfect, was at least legible. That world unraveled slowly, and then all at once. The Mongol invasions of the mid-13th century did not immediately erase Seljuk rule, but they hollowed it out. After defeat at Kurs Dag in 1243, Seljuk sultans remained on their thrones but no longer ruled independently. Real authority shifted eastward, toward the Mongol overlords of the Ilkhanate, whose interests lay elsewhere. Anatolia became a province in name, but a vacuum in practice. This kind of collapse is deceptive. There was no single moment when Seljuk governance ended. Courts still functioned. Titles were still granted. Coins were still minted. But the system that made these things meaningful, the ability to enforce decisions across space and time, had broken down. What remained was legitimacy without power, and power without legitimacy. Into this gap poured dozens of local rulers. Some were former Seljuk officials asserting autonomy. Others were tribal leaders who had never been fully integrated into the Seljuk system. Still others were warlords, band leaders, or religious figures who combined charisma with coercion. These principalities, later called beyliks, varied widely in size, culture, and ambition. Some controlled prosperous cities. Others barely held a cluster of villages. What united them was fragility. None could rely on inherited stability. Each depended on constant negotiation with neighbors, followers, and distant overlords. Alliances shifted quickly. Warfare was frequent but limited. Survival depended less on conquest than on managing uncertainty. For ordinary people, this fragmentation was both dangerous and familiar. Peasants, merchants, artisans, and nomads had lived through imperial rise and collapse before. What mattered to them was not ideology or dynasty, but protection. Who could keep roads open? Who could defend crops? Who could settle disputes without destroying livelihoods? In the absence of centralized authority, loyalty became transactional. This is crucial. In a fragmented Anatolia, power flowed upward from the local level. Leaders did not rule because they were crowned because they ruled. Authority was earned repeatedly, through action, rather than inherited once through lineage. Osman Beylik was one of many such experiments. His lands lay on the western edge of Anatolia, where Seljuk authority had always been weakest. This region had long functioned as a buffer zone between Islamic polities and the Byzantine world. Even at the height of Seljuk power, control here was uneven. After Seljuk collapse, it became a mosaic of competing influences. Importantly, fragmentation did not mean chaos. Trade routes still existed. Religious institutions still functioned. Legal traditions, both Islamic and customary, continued to shape daily life. What disappeared was the expectation that a single authority would resolve disputes across regions. Instead, power became layered, local, personal, and provisional. In this environment, scale was a liability. Large states attracted attention from rivals, from Mongols, from claimants and pretenders. Smaller entities could move quietly, adapt quickly, and avoid catastrophic defeat. Many beyliks deliberately avoided rapid expansion, preferring stability to ambition. The Ottomans began as one of the smallest. They lacked major cities, ancient prestige, or obvious economic advantage. But they operated in a system where those things mattered less than reliability. A ruler who could consistently protect followers, distribute land, and avoid entanglement with larger powers had an advantage over those who reached too far, too fast. This is where historical hindsight can mislead us. Knowing what the Ottomans would become, it is tempting to see Anatolia as a stage prepared for their rise. In reality, the landscape was littered with competitors who seemed, at the time, far more promising. The Ottomans were not obvious successors to Seljuk authority. They were simply one response among many to its absence. What made Anatolia after order distinctive was not collapse, but adaptation. People reorganized their lives around smaller units of power. Loyalties became flexible. Identities became situational. A man might fight for one lord, marry into another group, and trade under the protection of a third. Stability came not from permanence, but from balance. Osman's world rewarded those who understood this. He did not attempt to restore a lost empire or recreate Seljuk institutions. He did not claim universal authority. Instead, he worked within the grain of fragmentation, building a durable local network in a landscape where durability was rare. The absence of order did not paralyze Anatolia, it reshaped it. And it was within this reshaped world, pragmatic, provisional, and deeply human, that the Ottoman Beylik slowly took form, not as a solution to chaos, but as one of many ways people learned to live without certainty. The land Osman inhabited was not simply a border. It was a frontier, and that distinction matters. Borders imply clarity, one authority on one side, another beyond it. Frontiers, by contrast, are unstable spaces. They stretch, contract, and blur. They are places where rules are tested, identities soften, and power is negotiated rather than imposed. Northwestern Anatolia at the end of the 13th century was precisely such a space. Here, the world of Islamic Anatolia met the fatting edge of the Byzantine Empire, not in open confrontation, but in slow erosion. Byzantine control in the region had been weakening for generations. Imperial resources were stretched thin, focused on defending core territories rather than distant rural districts. Fortresses remained, but many were undermanned. Local governors often acted independently, balancing loyalty to Constantinople with the realities of survival. In some areas, Byzantine authority existed more as memory than force. This made the frontier porous. People crossed it constantly. Traders moved goods between worlds. Mercenaries sold their swords to whoever paid. Christian peasants lived under Muslim rulers. Muslim nomads grazed animals near Byzantine towns. Conversion happened, but slowly and unevenly. Daily life was shaped less by ideology than by proximity and need. Violence, when it came, was usually small-scale. Raids replaced campaigns. Skirmishes replaced pitched battles. Land changed hands incrementally, a village this year, a fortress a decade later. The frontier did not collapse dramatically, it thinned. This kind of environment favored a particular kind of leadership. Success did not depend on commanding large armies or enforcing strict hierarchies. It depended on reading local conditions, forming temporary alliances, and knowing when not to fight. Leaders who pushed too aggressively risked provoking retaliation they could not survive. Those who moved cautiously could expand without attracting overwhelming attention. Osman's Beylik benefited from this restraint. His forces were small and mobile. His authority was personal rather than bureaucratic. He did not need to defeat the Byzantine Empire, only to outlast its local presence. Time, not conquest, was his greatest ally. The frontier also created opportunities for social mobility. In more stable states, status was inherited. On the frontier, it was earned. A man who proved useful as a fighter, a negotiator, or an organizer could rise quickly. Loyalty mattered more than lineage. Skill mattered more than background. This attracted people. Warriors displaced from other regions, nomads seeking pasture, converts looking for belonging, all could find a place within a growing frontier community. The Ottomans did not demand uniformity. They offered participation. The term often used to describe early Ottoman fighters is Ghazi, frontier warriors fighting against non-Muslim lands. Later tradition invested this word with religious fervor, portraying the Ottomans as driven by holy war. But on the ground, reality was more complicated. Religion mattered, but but so did profit, survival, and opportunity. Many fighters moved fluidly between causes. Alliances crossed religious lines. Christian mercenaries fought alongside Muslim leaders. Muslim raiders spared Christian villages if it served their interests. Ideology provided language, not always motivation. Osman understood this flexibility instinctively. He did not try to impose rigid identities on a fluid world. His authority accommodated difference because difference was unavoidable. The frontier could not be governed like a heartland, and attempts to do so usually failed. Another advantage of the frontier was distance from central scrutiny. Neither the Mongol overlords nor Byzantine emperors watched this region closely. It was too marginal, too poor, too unstable to demand constant attention. This allowed local leaders room to experiment. Mistakes did not always lead to annihilation. Success did not immediately provoke suppression. For a small beylik, this invisibility was protective. Osman's expansion did not trigger alarms. Villages taken quietly did not provoke imperial response. Fortresses surrendered through negotiation did not demand retaliation. Growth happened beneath notice. The frontier also blurred moral categories. Raiding could be framed as defense. Settlement could follow violence. Alliances could shift without shame. What mattered was continuity, keeping people fed, land productive, and authority credible. In such a world, ideology hardened only later. At the beginning, survival came first. The Ottoman Beylik was not born in a vacuum, nor in a clash of civilizations. It emerged in a space where civilizations overlapped, faded, and recombined. The frontier was not merely a setting for Ottoman expansion. It was the condition that made Ottoman endurance possible. Without the frontier's ambiguity, Osman would have needed legitimacy he did not possess. Without its instability, he would have faced powers he could not challenge. Without its openness, he would not have attracted followers beyond his immediate kin. The frontier did not guarantee success. Many leaders failed there. But it created a world where small advantages could compound quietly, where patience mattered more than power, and adaptability more than ambition. That was the world the Ottomans learned to master. When the historical record finally gives us a name, it gives us very little else. Osman I enters history not as a fully formed ruler, but as a figure at the edge of documentation, mentioned briefly, remembered imperfectly, and later surrounded by stories that tell us more about Ottoman identity than about Osman himself. This absence is important. Unlike emperors and sultans who ruled from established capitals, Osman left behind no archives, no laws, no monumental inscriptions. What we know of him comes mostly from chronicles written long after his death, when the Ottomans had become powerful enough to look backward and ask where they had come from. By then, memory had already begun to harden into myth. Osman's father, Ertugrul, is himself a shadowy figure. Later tradition elevated him into a heroic forerunner, but contemporary evidence suggests he was one among many minor leaders operating on the Anatolian frontier. There is no clear sign that Ertugrul founded a state, commanded large forces, or envisioned dynastic rule. If Osman inherited anything from his father, it was not a kingdom, it was a network. That distinction matters. Osman did not ascend to power through succession in the way later Ottoman rulers would. There was no throne to inherit, no administrative machinery to assume control of. Leadership in this context was not automatic. It had to be asserted, maintained, and renewed constantly. Osman's authority rested on reputation. He needed to be seen as capable of defending territory, rewarding loyalty, resolving disputes, and navigating alliances. Failure in any of these areas could quickly unravel his position. Followers were not bound by law or oath in a modern sense. They stayed because staying made sense. This kind of leadership produced a different political personality. Osman does not appear as a distant ruler issuing commands from a palace. He appears as a man embedded in daily decision-making, negotiating marriages, settling conflicts, leading raids, distributing land. His power was close, visible, and personal. Later Ottoman writers would describe dreams, prophecies, and divine signs surrounding Osman's rise. These stories served a purpose. They retroactively justified rule by presenting it as inevitable. But at the time, nothing about Osman's position was secure enough to feel destined. In fact, he faced constraints that are easy to underestimate. His territory was small and exposed. His neighbors were rivals, not subordinates. His relationship with Mongol authority was ambiguous, distant enough to avoid direct interference, but close enough to require caution. A single miscalculation could have erased his Beylik entirely. What seems to have distinguished Osman was not ambition, but judgment. He did not rush to claim grand titles. He did not overextend his forces. He expanded slowly, testing resistance, retreating when necessary, advancing when conditions allowed. This restraint is rarely celebrated in heroic narratives, but it is often the difference between survival and extinction. Osman also appears to have understood the value of continuity. Rather than presenting himself as a revolutionary figure, he positioned his leadership as familiar. Local customs were respected. Existing arrangements were modified rather than destroyed. Authority felt incremental, not imposed. This made his rule legible. People could understand what Osman offered because it resembled what they already knew, only more reliable. In a fragmented world, predictability was power. Osman's personal relationships were central to this strategy. Marriage alliances connected him to neighboring groups. Loyal companions formed the core of his military strength. Trust accumulated over time, not through ideology, but through shared experience. The Ottoman polity at this stage was less a state than a household enlarged. It revolved around Osman as a person, not an office. When he led, the group moved. When he judged, disputes settled. When he succeeded, loyalty deepened. This made the early Ottoman structure both resilient and fragile, resilient so long as leadership held, fragile if it did not. That fragility explains why so little was recorded. From the outside, Osman's Beylik did not yet look like history in the making. It looked like one more local arrangement in a landscape full of them. Chroniclers focused their attention elsewhere, on courts, capitals, and recognized powers. Osman mattered later because his structure outlived him. What he built did not depend entirely on his personal charisma. It created habits, ways of expanding, governing, and absorbing new people that could be inherited. When leadership passed on, the pattern remained. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Osman. He was not great because he imagined an empire. He was effective because he built something that could continue without him. In a world where to call Osman a ruler risks misunderstanding the nature of his authority. He did not govern a state in the institutional sense. There was no bureaucracy to administer land, no legal code enforced across territory, no standing army maintained through taxation. What Osman led was something more fragile and more flexible, a coalition of people bound together by expectation rather than law. This distinction is crucial. In the late 13th century, the idea of centralized governance still existed in memory, but not in practice, especially on the frontier. Large political systems had collapsed or retreated. What remained were leaders who ruled through proximity, not distance, through presence, not paperwork. Osman's leadership operated in this space. Authority was not automatic. It had to be demonstrated continuously. Every raid, negotiation, and settlement was a test. Followers watched closely. Success strengthened loyalty. Failure invited departure. There were no formal penalties for leaving, only the risk of choosing poorly. This created a political environment, unlike later Ottoman rule. Decisions were made quickly, often collectively. Consultation mattered, not as ideology, but as necessity. A leader who ignored the concerns of his followers risked isolation. Osman's power depended on consensus as much as command. Land distribution illustrates this well. There was no centralized land registry or permanent assignment system. Instead, land was granted informally to those who could work and defend it. These grants were revocable, flexible, and deeply personal. They tied followers to leadership not through law, but through benefit. This made loyalty practical, rather than symbolic. In return, Osman expected service, military support, mediation in disputes, and participation in expansion. The relationship was reciprocal. Leadership without reciprocity did not survive long in this environment. Justice followed a similar pattern. Disputes were settled locally, often through mediation rather than coercion. Osman's role was not to impose abstract law, but to preserve cohesion. A judgment that fractured the group was a failed judgment, even if it appeared correct by formal standards. This pragmatic approach would later be remembered as wisdom. At the time, it was simply necessary. The early Ottoman polity could not afford internal division. Every follower mattered. Leadership meant keeping people together more than enforcing rules. Military organization reflected the same logic. There was no permanent army. Fighters gathered when opportunity arose and dispersed when it did not. Campaigns were seasonal and limited. Resources were scarce, and overextension was dangerous. Victory came not from overwhelming force, but from timing and local knowledge. Osman's role in warfare was as coordinator rather than commander-in-chief. He balanced risk, chose targets carefully, and avoided decisive battles that could destroy his limited manpower. Small gains accumulated slowly. Losses, when they occurred, were absorbed without collapse because expectations were modest. This model favored endurance over glory. It also encouraged adaptability. New followers could be incorporated quickly. Local practices could be adopted without resistance. Authority adjusted to circumstances rather than resisting them. Crucially, leadership without a state reduced the cost of failure. If a campaign failed, the entire system did not unravel. There were no institutions to collapse, no administrative networks to destroy. The group could retreat, regroup, and try again. Survival did not depend on perfection. This resilience is often overlooked. Modern narratives tend to privilege strong institutions and centralized power, but in volatile environments, flexibility often outperforms structure. The early Ottomans succeeded not because they were organized, but because they were adaptable. Osman's leadership also blurred the line between public and private authority. Personal relationships were political assets. Marriage alliances doubled as diplomatic treaties. Hospitality created obligation. Shared hardship forged loyalty. Power was intimate. This intimacy limited scale, but enhanced trust. As the Ottoman polity grew, this model would strain and eventually transform. Institutions would emerge. Bureaucracy would replace personal negotiation. Law would formalize custom. But at the beginning, none of that existed. What existed was leadership practiced daily, face to face. Osman did not rule from a capital because there was none. He ruled from wherever he was needed in council, in camp, or in motion. Authority traveled with him, not ahead of him. This form of leadership was not unique, but it was well suited to its time and place. Many beyliks operated similarly. Most did not last. The difference was continuity. Osman's approach created habits that could be passed on. Leadership without a state became leadership that could eventually support one. The Ottoman state did not replace this early model overnight. It grew out of it. Understanding this period means letting go of later expectations. Osman was not failing to build institutions. He was leading. The early Ottoman community did not grow because it was orderly. It grew because it was open. Osman's followers were not a single people with a shared origin story. They were a mixture of backgrounds, motives, and expectations, drawn together less by identity than by possibility. In a fragmented Anatolia, opportunity was a powerful force, and the Ottoman Beylik became a place where it could be pursued. Later generations would describe these early followers as ghazis, warriors fighting on the frontier of Islam. The term carried moral weight and religious purpose. It suggested unity, discipline, and sacred mission. But in Osman's lifetime, the reality was more fluid. Being a ghazi was not a fixed identity. It was a role. Men moved in and out of it depending on circumstance. Some fought for religious reasons, others for land, plunder, or protection. Many did not separate these motives at all. Faith, survival, and ambition blended together in ways that are difficult to disentangle. This ambiguity was not a weakness. In fact, it was one of the Ottoman Beylik's greatest strengths. Rigid communities fracture easily when conditions change. Flexible ones adapt. Osman did not demand ideological purity from those who joined him. He offered something more practical, participation in a system that rewarded contribution. If you fought, you could gain land. If you settled, you could gain security. If you served, you could rise. For migrants displaced by war, famine, or political collapse elsewhere in Anatolia, this mattered deeply. Many people had already lost attachments to older authorities. What they sought was not legitimacy, but stability. Osman's Beylik offered neither guarantees nor permanence, but it offered movement. Those who joined were not promised peace. They were promised a chance. The frontier attracted people accustomed to uncertainty. Nomads seeking pasture, warriors without patrons, families escaping regions where power had hardened into oppression, all found room on the margins. The Ottoman community did not erase difference, it absorbed it. This absorption reshaped the group itself. As new followers arrived, customs blended, practices shifted, leadership styles adapted. There was no fixed Ottoman identity to protect. Identity emerged from experience, not doctrine. This made the group resilient. A community built around strict definitions must constantly defend them. A community built around opportunity grows by inclusion. Osman's leadership leaned toward the latter, not out of idealism, but necessity. Military success reinforced this dynamic. Each successful raid or negotiated surrender created new resources, land, livestock, captives, tribute. These gains were redistributed among followers, strengthening loyalty and attracting newcomers. Momentum mattered. People followed success. Importantly, expansion was not purely violent. Many villages came under Ottoman authority without destruction. Local populations were often left in place, taxed lightly, and integrated gradually. For peasants exhausted by instability, this could be an improvement rather than a catastrophe. Conversion followed a similar pattern. Some converts embraced Islam sincerely. Others did so pragmatically. Many did not convert at all, living under Ottoman rule as they had under Byzantine or Seljuk authority. The early Ottoman polity did not require uniform belief, it required cooperation. This tolerance was not philosophical. It was structural. The Ottomans lacked the capacity to enforce uniformity, and they understood that coercion would undermine growth. Inclusion, even imperfect inclusion, produced better results. Social mobility reinforced loyalty. Men of humble origin could rise through service. Leadership roles were not closed off by birth. What mattered was usefulness in war, in negotiation, in administration. This created investment. Followers were not merely subjects, they were stakeholders. Such systems generate strong bonds. People who rise together, who take risks together, and who share rewards together develop loyalty that outlasts individual leaders. This loyalty was not abstract. It was personal, practical, and tested repeatedly. But this openness carried risks. A community without clear boundaries can fracture. Competing ambitions can destabilize leadership. Osman had to balance inclusion with cohesion, allowing diversity. The expansion of the early Ottoman Beylik did not unfold against a strong and coherent enemy. It unfolded into a vacuum. By the late 13th century, the Byzantine Empire still existed, still claimed authority, and still imagined itself as a universal power. But in northwestern Anatolia, that authority had thinned to the point of abstraction. What remained were isolated outposts of a once-dominant system, fortresses without support, officials without resources, and communities left largely to manage their own survival. This was not sudden collapse. The Byzantine retreat from Anatolia had been gradual, uneven, and deeply demoralizing. Decades of war, internal conflict, and shifting priorities had drained the empire's ability to project power far from its core territories. Constantinople still mattered. The frontier did not. Imperial attention followed threat and wealth. Northwestern Anatolia offered neither. As a result, Byzantine presence in the region became symbolic rather than effective. Governors held titles but lacked troops. Garrisons existed but were underpaid and understaffed. Fortifications stood, but often without the means to be repaired or properly defended. For local populations, this created uncertainty rather than resistance. Peasants living under Byzantine rule were not defending an idea of empire. They were trying to survive harvests, raids, and tax demands that no longer translated into protection. Loyalty, once again, became conditional. This is where the notion of conquest becomes misleading. Early Ottoman expansion into Byzantine lands rarely resembled a dramatic overthrow. More often, it resembled substitution. Authority changed hands not because it was violently seized, but because it was quietly abandoned. Villages negotiated surrender. Fortresses accepted new overlords in exchange for security. Some resisted, briefly and fiercely, but most recognized the imbalance. The empire could not respond. Reinforcements did not come. For the Ottomans, this was an opportunity, but a delicate one. Aggressive conquest could provoke a response that Osman could not withstand. Slow absorption, by contrast, allowed expansion without drawing attention. Each gain was modest enough to appear insignificant, yet cumulative enough to reshape the region. Time worked in the Ottomans' favor. The longer Byzantine authority remained absent in practice, the more normal its absence became. Ottoman rule filled the space left behind, not immediately, not comprehensively, but persistently. Importantly, this process did not require mass displacement. Many Christian communities remained in place under Ottoman control. Local leaders were often retained. Taxes changed, but daily life did not always worsen. For people accustomed to instability, continuity mattered more than allegiance. This undermined resistance. Defending Byzantine authority required belief in its return. As years passed without meaningful imperial intervention, that belief eroded. Ottoman rule, initially provisional, began to feel permanent simply because it was present. The vacuum was not only military, it was administrative and psychological. Byzantine law still existed in theory, but enforcement was inconsistent. Disputes went unresolved. Land claims became ambiguous. In this context, a local authority capable of decisive action, even informal action, gained legitimacy. Osman and his followers provided that decisiveness. They did not replace Byzantine institutions wholesale. They adapted them, simplified them, and often left them largely intact. What changed was the chain of accountability. Authority became local, immediate, and responsive. This created a subtle shift in loyalty. People did not necessarily become Ottoman in identity. They became Ottoman in habit. They paid taxes, sought judgment, and negotiated protection through new channels. Over time, these habits hardened into expectations. The Byzantine vacuum also shaped Ottoman self-perception. Expansion into weakened territory reinforced a model of growth based on opportunity rather than confrontation. The Ottomans learned that patience yielded results. They learned that conquest did not require annihilation. They learned that endurance could be more effective than force. These lessons mattered later. When the Ottomans eventually confronted stronger opponents, they carried with them habits formed in this vacuum: caution, negotiation, and incrementalism. The frontier had taught them how to grow without overreaching. It is tempting to imagine the Byzantine Empire as a fading but still coherent rival. When we think of medieval conquest, we often imagine devastation, burned cities, displaced populations, and abrupt rupture. That image is not false, but it is incomplete. In the early Ottoman experience, expansion frequently took a quieter form, one shaped less by annihilation than by accommodation. This was not because the Ottomans were unusually humane. It was because destruction was inefficient. Osman's Beylik lacked the manpower and resources to govern ruined land. A village destroyed produced no food, no taxes, and no stability. A fortress leveled left a gap that someone else would eventually fill. Survival demanded continuity. As a result, conquest often became negotiation. Villages facing Ottoman pressure were offered terms. Fortresses were approached with patience rather than force. Local leaders were allowed to retain authority under new oversight. Taxes were adjusted to be bearable. In many cases, life continued with fewer changes than outsiders might expect. This approach had immediate benefits. First, it minimized resistance. Communities that did not feel existentially threatened had less reason to fight to the end. Second, it preserved economic productivity. Fields remained cultivated. Trade continued. The Ottoman group could sustain itself without overextension. Third, it created legitimacy. Authority gained through accommodation felt more durable than authority imposed through terror. People obeyed not because they were crushed, but because compliance made sense. Over time, pragmatic obedience hardened into acceptance. This pattern also reflects the limits of early Ottoman power. Osman could not afford prolonged sieges or large-scale campaigns. His forces were small, and losses were difficult to replace. Avoiding destruction was not a moral choice, it was a strategic necessity. That necessity shaped policy. Land was redistributed but not indiscriminately. Existing cultivators were often left in place. New settlers were introduced gradually. Religious institutions were not dismantled overnight. Conversion, when it happened, unfolded across generations. This created a layered society rather than a replaced one. Christians lived alongside Muslims. Old customs persisted under new authority. Legal pluralism, different rules for different communities, emerged not as doctrine but as practice. Such pluralism reduced friction. People could continue living as they had, with adjustments rather than upheaval. This made Ottoman rule easier to maintain and harder to dislodge. A population that survives conquest intact has less incentive to rebel. Importantly, This approach also moderated Ottoman ambition. Rapid conquest often demands centralized control and ideological justification. Incremental expansion allows authority to remain personal and flexible. Osman's Beylik expanded only as fast as it could absorb new territory without destabilization. This discipline prevented collapse. Many frontier leaders overreached, conquering land they could not hold. Their authority fractured under the weight of administration. The Ottomans avoided this trap by expanding slowly enough to adapt structures organically. Conquest without destruction also shaped Ottoman reputation. News traveled. Communities under threat heard stories from neighbors who had surrendered and survived. Fear gave way to calculation. Ottoman advance came to be seen not as annihilation, but as transition. This did not eliminate resistance, but it changed its nature. Defenders fought when they believed resistance could bring better terms. They surrendered when they believed continued loyalty to distant authorities offered nothing in return. Over time, this pattern produced a cumulative effect. Each peaceful transition made the next more likely. Each intact village strengthened the Ottoman economy. Each negotiated surrender normalized Ottoman authority. This was not conquest as spectacle. It was conquest as process. The absence of mass destruction also preserved memory. Communities retained continuity across political change. People remembered earlier rulers but adapted to new ones. Over generations, the memory of Byzantine authority faded, not through trauma, but through irrelevance. Ottoman rule did not erase the past. It outlasted it. This method would later become a hallmark of Ottoman governance, but its origins lay not. The early expansion of the Ottoman Beylik was not driven by conquest alone. Much of its growth happened quietly, through ties that never appeared on a battlefield. Marriage, alliance, and personal obligation were among the most effective tools Osman possessed, not because they guaranteed loyalty, but because they softened resistance. In a fragmented world, power rarely moved in straight lines. It flowed through households, kinship networks, and negotiated relationships. Osman understood this instinctively. In the absence of formal diplomacy, marriage functioned as politics by other means. A union could transform a rival into a partner, a neighbor into family, and uncertainty into obligation. These alliances did not erase competition, but they delayed conflict, often long enough for conditions to change. Such marriages were not romantic gestures. They were stabilizing instruments. They created shared interests where none had existed before. They reduced the likelihood of sudden betrayal. They offered legitimacy in regions where blood ties mattered more than proclamations. Alliance building extended beyond marriage. Local leaders who submitted were often retained rather than replaced. Their authority was folded into the Ottoman structure, not erased. In return, they gained protection, continuity, and a stake in the new order. This approach turned potential enemies into collaborators. Rather than ruling over conquered populations as outsiders, the Ottomans inserted themselves into existing networks of authority. Governance became familiar, not foreign. Change arrived gradually, embedded in relationships rather than imposed from above. Adaptation was the common thread. The early Ottoman polity did not arrive with a fixed model of rule. It borrowed, adjusted, and improvised. Practices that worked were retained. Those that did not were quietly abandoned. There was no doctrine insisting on uniformity. This flexibility reduced friction. Different regions were governed differently. Customs varied. Legal practices overlapped. What mattered was not consistency but cohesion. The Ottoman leadership did not ask whether a system was ideologically pure. It asked whether it held people together. Adaptation also applied to culture. Language, dress, and ritual reflected local influence as much as inherited tradition. The Ottoman identity, still in formation, absorbed elements from its surroundings. This made it intelligible to those it governed. Identity followed power, not the other way around. This openness had long-term consequences. Because authority rested on relationships, not abstract principles, it could expand without provoking immediate backlash. People did not feel conquered by a foreign civilization. They felt absorbed into a new arrangement that still recognized their place. Such systems are difficult to categorize. They are not empires in the classical sense, nor are they tribal confederations. They are transitional forms, adaptive, relational, and inherently unstable. Most collapse under their own ambiguity. The Ottomans did not. Their alliances endured because they were constantly renegotiated. Authority was not assumed to be permanent. It was reaffirmed through ongoing engagement. This required attention, restraint, and compromise. Osman's leadership style reflected this reality. He did not seek to dominate every interaction. He sought to remain indispensable as mediator, protector, and guarantor of balance. That role created loyalty deeper than coercion. People remained within the Ottoman sphere not because they were forced to, but because leaving carried risk. Stability, once experienced, became valuable. Marriage, alliance, and adaptation did not produce dramatic victories. They produced continuity. And continuity, when later Ottoman chroniclers looked back at the rise of their state, they did not see uncertainty. They saw inevitability. Osman became more than a frontier leader. He became a chosen figure, guided by divine signs, destined for greatness, and marked by prophecy. Dreams were recorded. Symbols were interpreted. The Ottoman rise was recast as the fulfillment of a higher plan. These stories served a purpose. Empires need origins that justify their existence. They require narratives that explain not just how power was gained, but why it deserved to be held. Destiny provides that explanation. It transforms contingency into meaning. But for those living in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, there was no sense of inevitability. Osman's position was fragile. His authority could have collapsed through defeat, betrayal, or simple misfortune. Many comparable beyliks did collapse. History remembers the Ottomans not because success was assured, but because it was rare. The myth of destiny emerged after survival. Only once the Ottoman polity had endured long enough to appear stable did people begin to search for signs that it had always been meant to endure. The future shaped the past. This retrospective certainty obscures the reality of early Ottoman life. Decisions were made without knowledge of outcome. Alliances were formed without assurance they would hold. Expansion occurred without confidence it could continue. Each step forward carried the risk of erasure. This uncertainty is essential to understanding Ottoman success. A leadership convinced of its own destiny tends to overreach. A leadership aware of its fragility tends to adapt. Osman's actions suggest the latter. He behaved not as a man fulfilling prophecy, but as one navigating constant risk. The dream narratives, recorded generations later, reflect what the Ottomans needed to believe once they had become powerful. They provided moral coherence. They linked expansion to divine favor. They offered a sense of purpose that could unite diverse populations under a single banner. But they tell us little about motivation at the beginning. Early Ottoman expansion was not driven by a sense of manifest destiny. It was driven by opportunity, restraint, and response to local conditions. Religion offered language and legitimacy, but it did not dictate outcomes. The myth also simplified complexity. It reduced a web of relationships, compromises, and contingencies into a linear story of rise. It transformed collective effort into individual genius. It elevated Osman from participant to origin. This process is common in imperial histories. Founders are remembered as visionaries even when they acted pragmatically. Success is portrayed as planned even when it was accidental. Failure is forgotten while survival is sanctified. The Ottomans were no exception. Understanding the myth of destiny does not require rejecting it outright. It requires recognizing its function. These narratives shaped Ottoman identity, reinforced loyalty, and legitimized authority. They mattered, but they mattered later. At the beginning, there was no destiny to fulfill. There was only uncertainty to manage. And it was precisely this absence of certainty that allowed the Ottoman polity to remain flexible. Without a rigid sense of purpose, it could adapt to changing circumstances. Without an ideology demanding constant expansion, it could pause, consolidate, and endure. Destiny in this sense was a product of success, not its cause. The Ottomans did not rise because they believed they must. They rose because they survived long enough to believe they always would. Dates give history a sense of order. They allow us to organize events into timelines, identify turning points, and tell coherent stories. Without them, the past would feel unstructured and overwhelming. But dates also create illusions, the illusion that change happens suddenly, that beginnings are clear, and that outcomes can be traced to single moments. The year 1299 is one such illusion. It is commonly cited as the founding year of the Ottoman state, the moment when Osman is said to have declared independence from Seljuk authority and established a new political entity. In textbooks and summaries, 1299 appears as a clean break, a line separating what came before from what followed. In reality, nothing so neat occurred. There is no contemporary record of a declaration. No document announces the birth of a new state. No evidence suggests that those living at the time understood 1299 as a decisive year. The date matters not because something unmistakable happened then, but because historians later needed something to point to. 1299 matters as a marker, not an event. It represents a phase in which Osman's leadership had endured long enough to appear autonomous. Seljuk authority, already weakened and largely symbolic in the region, had receded to the point of irrelevance. Osman was no longer acting as a subordinate, but he had not suddenly changed his behavior. He continued doing what he had been doing before. This continuity is the key. The Ottoman Beylik did not begin when Osman broke away. It began when his group survived long enough for separation to be noticed. Independence was not declared, it was assumed over time. So why does 1299 persist? Because history requires simplification. Faced with centuries of gradual change, historians look for moments that can stand in for processes. 1299 became one such stand-in. It offered a convenient anchor early enough to mark origins, late enough to align with Ottoman endurance. But using it as a true beginning distorts understanding. It encourages us to imagine the Ottomans as a state from the start, rather than as a fluid community slowly acquiring structure. It suggests intention where there was adaptation, and design where there was response. At the same time, dismissing 1299 entirely would also miss something important. The year matters not because it marks creation, but because it marks recognition. By this point, Osman's leadership had crossed a threshold. His authority was no longer temporary. His group had established patterns of expansion, governance, and continuity that distinguished it from others. In that sense, 1299 reflects consolidation. It is the moment when survival became stability, when persistence began to resemble. At the moment of its emergence, the Ottoman Beylik did not announce itself to the world. It barely announced itself to history. There was no sense that something unprecedented had begun, no expectation that this small frontier community would outlast its rivals, let alone shape continents. What existed was a local solution to local problems, a way of organizing people, land, and power in an environment where certainty had vanished. This is why the metaphor of a ripple is fitting. A ripple does not overwhelm immediately. It spreads quietly, outward, shaped by the conditions it encounters. It strengthens or fades depending on resistance, terrain, and time. The early Ottoman polity was such a ripple, moving across the fractured surface of Anatolia, adjusting its shape without losing momentum. What made this ripple endure was not scale, but direction. Osman and his followers did not attempt to restore the past or impose a future. They responded to the present. Each decision, whether to fight, negotiate, marry, or wait, was shaped by immediate realities rather than abstract goals. This responsiveness created a pattern. Over time, habits formed: cautious expansion, negotiated authority, inclusion of diverse populations, and respect for local structures. These habits became traditions. Traditions became expectations. Expectations became institutions. None of this was visible at the beginning. From the outside, the Ottoman Beylik looked unremarkable. It lacked the prestige of older dynasties, the wealth of established cities, and the ideological clarity of reform movements. It survived because it did not demand more than it could sustain. Endurance became its defining feature. The first ripple did not carry the weight of empire. It carried the discipline of survival. It taught the Ottomans how to grow without breaking, how to rule without rigid structures, and how to expand without provoking collapse. These lessons mattered long after Osman's death. Later Ottoman rulers inherited not a blueprint, but a mindset. They learned that authority could be layered, that conquest need not mean destruction, and that diversity could be managed rather than erased. When institutions eventually formed, they did so upon foundations already tested by experience. This continuity distinguishes the Ottoman case. Many states are born through rupture, revolution, conquest, or sudden transformation. The Ottoman state emerged through persistence. It was shaped by what it avoided as much as by what it pursued. The early Beylik did not imagine itself as an empire, but it learned how to endure like one. That is why its origins resist dramatic storytelling. There is no single turning point, no decisive battle, no declaration that explains everything that followed. The beginnings of Ottoman power were quiet, provisional, and deeply contingent. And yet, from these unassuming origins came one of the longest-lasting political entities in history. Not because it was destined to rule, not because it was uniquely virtuous or visionary, but because, at a moment when many failed, it learned how to survive, and then how to continue surviving at a larger scale. The founding of the Ottoman Beylik was not the start of an empire. It was the beginning of a way of responding to uncertainty. And that response, flexible, patient, and adaptive, would echo outward for centuries. If you'd like to keep exploring history's biggest questions, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey. And if there's a moment from the past you think deserves a deeper look, feel free to share it in the comments.